Welcome everyone to another chilling episode of True Scary Stories with relaxing rain sounds. Be sure to like this video, subscribe for more videos like this, and leave a comment telling me where and when you're watching. I would love to hear from you. Now, sit back, relax, and let the darkness take over. After my son was born, my then-husband and I decided to buy a 100-year-old house to accommodate our growing family, which included the three of us and our medium-sized dog. I'd always been a bit fearful of the dark, stemming from an unsettling experience during my childhood when a neighbor boy had been spotted peering into my windows. As I adjusted to life in our old home, I often had to remind myself that the creaks and bumps I heard in the house were simply the result of its age. The large, old-growth trees scraped against the roof and windows at night, while the noisy radiant heat system, the back gate that stubbornly refused to stay closed, and the occasional wind would add to the sounds of the night. Though these things made me nervous, I would tell myself they were perfectly normal, even though every now and then I would hide under the covers, too scared to investigate. When my then-husband and I separated, I kept the creaky house and the dog, as he wanted to keep our medium-sized dog. It wasn't long after that when I had an experience that would leave me unsettled for much longer than I expected. One evening, when my son was still small, we were watching a movie in the front room. It was around dusk when my phone suddenly died. As someone who tends to be more relaxed about things, I'd never kept a charger in one place. More often than not, I would find them scattered around the house. On this occasion, it was in the kitchen. I decided to cross the house to plug it in, but as I reached the counter, I suddenly had a strange, overpowering sense that something was very wrong. It wasn't a feeling of being scared, but a deep, sinking feeling in my gut that something was off. I turned, and that's when I saw it. Not only was the back gate wide open again, but there was someone sitting cross-legged in the yard, staring at the house. The person wore a hood and dark sunglasses, even though there was still a hint of light in the sky. What made the situation even stranger was that they didn't move an inch. I thought at first I might be imagining it, but no. They remained perfectly still even when I stepped closer to the window to get a better look. I was certain that they knew I had seen them, yet they did not react. The eerie stillness of the situation made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I quickly locked the back door and grabbed my phone and charger, heading into the dining room where I had my laptop. My first priority was to contact someone, anyone who could help. I messaged the first person I saw online, letting them know what was happening. Someone was sitting in my yard, staring at my house, and my phone had died. I asked them to call the authorities if they didn't hear from me in a few minutes. I assumed the person would leave once they realized they'd been spotted, but the minutes dragged on, and I found myself growing increasingly anxious. The stillness outside was unsettling, and my son, ever the curious child, wanted to know why we weren't going to the kitchen for a glass of water. I did my best to distract him, all the while watching my phone, which finally came to life. I quickly dialed 911. The dispatcher asked me to calmly explain the situation and promised to send an officer, but I was so rattled that I could hardly speak clearly. I assured her that the person was probably gone, but I insisted that an officer come to check the yard. The dispatcher stayed on the phone with me, asking if I could look out a window without being noticed to verify the situation. I tried to move quietly to the kitchen, but as I knelt down to check, I suddenly realized something chilling. While the back door was locked, the dog door was still wide open, and there was no way to block it. Panic surged through me as I stood up, trying to scan the yard. Just as I did, I came face to face with the hooded figure, their dark sunglasses locked on me from outside the window. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't contain my panic as I mumbled into the phone. The dispatcher urged me to grab my son and get to a locked room immediately. I ran to my son, explaining in a panic that we needed to leave the house right away. As I picked him up, I heard the unmistakable sound of the dog door slowly swinging open. That was it. I knew we had to go, and fast. Without looking back, I dashed out of the house, leaving the front door wide open. I ran across the street to my neighbor's house and frantically knocked on their door. They graciously took us in, pausing their dinner party to distract my son while I stood at the window, trying to hold myself together as I sobbed. My heart broke knowing that I had left our indoor cat behind. Not long after, the police arrived. The officers had gone through the side gate and found the person calmly sitting on my back step. They had been using the dog door to reach inside and were found with their arm swinging in and out, as though it were no big deal. I had blocked the dog door shut that very night, but the damage had already been done. The unsettling feeling I had experienced over the months, the strange noises at night, the back gate opening on its own, took on a much darker significance. It made me question whether those were just the sounds of an old house or something more sinister. In the end, we moved not long after that night. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house, no matter how creaky or old, wasn't the only thing that was unsettling. The events left me with a deep sense of unease, and while I never fully understood what had happened, I couldn't bring myself to stay there any longer. It was a decision I would never regret. Back in the early 2010s, I was in my mid-20s, living a carefree life as a broke expat in Barcelona. One evening, after enjoying a concert, I was walking home with one of my roommates, a fellow Brit. We had stayed out a bit later than usual, probably around midnight or 1 a.m., and were strolling through a relatively quiet but central part of the city, heading toward a subway station. The night had been fun, and we were in high spirits, having had a couple of drinks. We weren't drunk, just a little tipsy, laughing and chatting, perhaps a bit louder than usual. The weather was still warm for late October, with the cool air and a slight mist under the streetlights giving the evening a magical glow. As we walked arm in arm toward the subway entrance at the far end of the street, a gust of wind blew a few leaves across the pavement. That's when we noticed something strange. A figure walking ahead of us, barely visible in the mist. At first, it looked like an elderly woman, hunched over, carrying bags in each hand, and walking with a noticeable limp, dragging one of her legs behind her. We were speaking English, getting close to passing her on the sidewalk, when she suddenly called out, rather exaggeratedly, in English but with a thick Spanish accent, "Oh, help! Won't somebody help me?" Her voice wasn't filled with fear, but more with a demanding tone, as if she fully expected to be assisted. My roommate was already trying to keep walking past her, but I hesitated, my instincts telling me to stop. After all, she was an elderly woman, struggling to walk with heavy bags late at night. I asked her what she needed help with, and she quickly responded, "It's my leg. Help me carry the bags. I live just over there." She pointed toward an apartment building just a short distance away. I felt a tug at my conscience and instinctively said, "Of course we'll help you." My roommate was less enthusiastic, but reluctantly followed me as we each grabbed one of the woman's bags and made our way toward the apartment's doorstep. As we got closer, the woman's face came into sharper view under the streetlight, and I couldn't help but notice how much she resembled a character straight out of a fairy tale. Her bent posture, a noticeable wart on her nose, gray, straggly hair, and dark woolen clothing with a hood. I was taken aback by her appearance, but tried not to react, reminding myself that it didn't matter what she looked like. She was just an old woman who needed help. When we reached the doorstep, something felt off. The building's front door was slightly ajar, which was unusual for the area. The woman opened it with surprising ease, seeming to have gained strength all of a sudden. She gestured for me to go inside first, saying, "Just up the stairs, just up the stairs." There was a moment where I froze in the doorway, my tipsy mind trying to process the situation. Logically, I knew it would be polite to help her up the stairs, but the feeling in my gut was telling me something wasn't right. The hallway and narrow staircase ahead of me were dimly lit, casting an eerie glow, and a stale, musty smell of smoke drifted down from the top of the stairs. I could just make out a door at the top, slightly ajar, leading into what looked like an apartment. The woman's voice, insistent and urgent, urged me to hurry inside and go up the stairs quickly. In that moment, it felt like something straight out of a horror movie. I found myself giggling nervously, thinking, "This can't be real. It's too cliché to be dangerous." But the unsettling feeling in my stomach grew stronger, and before I could act on my doubts, my roommate, who had been silently observing, suddenly shouted, "Oh no!" grabbed my arm, and pulled me out of the doorway. As we quickly left the building and crossed the street, the woman's disappointed voice followed us, but we didn't look back. My roommate didn't stop pulling me until we were safely inside the brightly lit subway station, surrounded by people. Once we had calmed down, my roommate explained why she had reacted so strongly. She pointed out two things that had set off alarm bells in her head. First, she was sure the woman hadn't been limping when we first saw her from behind. The limp seemed to appear only as we got closer. Second, and more chilling, she said, "As you were standing in the doorway, I just knew there was someone waiting for us at the top of the stairs. Someone who was going to lock you in a room or something." It was a bit of a dramatic interpretation, but the instinct was spot on. Maybe it was just our imaginations running wild, but I've never been so grateful for my roommate's quick thinking. I still can't shake the feeling that we narrowly avoided something much worse that night, and I'll never forget the eerie sensation that something sinister was hiding just out of sight. When I was around 13, I lived on the first floor of a 6-story apartment building. Every time I had to take out the garbage, it meant walking out of our apartment and down a long driveway to the garage room. It wasn't the best task, but it was something I had to do. One late evening, my mom asked me to take out the trash, and she asked my older brother to come with me. We finished with the garbage, and as we were heading back inside, we noticed something strange. A big, cream-white truck just parked there. There wasn't anything particularly weird about the truck, but something about it didn't sit right with us, and we just wanted to get inside as quickly as possible. So we decided to use the fire escape to avoid getting too close to the truck. We pushed open the fire escape door, and that's when everything changed. Out of nowhere, a guy, maybe in his early 20s, stepped in front of the door and stopped it from closing. I tried to force it shut to get away from him, but before I could even think, he pulled out a big, intimidating knife and said something I'll never forget. He told me, "Let me in or I'll slice you open," in this calm yet threatening tone. I was paralyzed with fear. I didn't know what to do. My heart was pounding, and I was completely frozen. I didn't want to make him mad. So I stepped back and let him in. Once I opened the door, I ran back up to my apartment as fast as I could. My entire body was shaking, but I didn't tell my mom anything. I didn't even mention it to my brother. I just locked myself in my room and tried to block out what had just happened. What happened next is something I'll never forget. That man, the one I had let inside, went on to break into 2 apartments in the building. One of those apartments was home to a gay couple, and the other to a woman living alone. He attacked both of them, hurting them badly. The building's security quickly evacuated everyone, and we were all rushed outside for safety. But here's the terrifying part. Anyone living above the 3rd floor, including us, was told we couldn't leave. They didn't want the criminal to get away or harm anyone else. Later, I found out that he managed to escape through the back gate of the building and ran off. But by then it was too late. The damage had already been done. I still can't stop thinking about what could have happened if I had just told my mom right away, or stood up to him. Maybe I could have stopped him before he hurt anyone. Maybe those attacks wouldn't have happened if I hadn't let him in. I often find myself blaming myself, thinking I'm the reason all of this went down. If I had just done things differently, maybe everything would have turned out fine. The guilt still haunts me. It's one of those moments that you can never undo, no matter how badly you wish you could. And I'll never stop wondering, what if I hadn't let him in? What if I had told my mom immediately? Would those people still be safe today? When I was a toddler, I had a moment that still sticks in my mom's memory, and honestly, mine too. It was a regular morning, and everything seemed to be going fine. My mom was getting ready for work, and I was being my usual self, content and calm. But the moment she tried to walk out the door, something strange happened. Suddenly, I became completely inconsolable. My mother says I gripped her clothes with all my might, wrapped my little legs tightly around her, and screamed at the top of my lungs, "No, don't go!" It was like a switch had flipped in me and nothing would calm me down. No matter what my mom tried, I wouldn't let go. My siblings tried to entertain me to distract me, but nothing worked. I was determined to stop her from leaving. At that time, being a single mother of 6 kids in the 1960s was no easy task. My mom had mouths to feed and bills to pay, so she couldn't afford to miss work. But I wouldn't give up. She did everything she could to get me to stop crying, but it was all in vain. Finally, out of desperation, she called her workplace and explained the situation, telling them that I had suddenly become very sick and was too unwell for her to leave. About 5 minutes after hanging up the phone, and with me still in her arms, something completely unexpected happened. I suddenly stopped wiggling and squirming. I looked up at her and said in the sweetest voice, "I love you, Mama. You can go to work now. Bye." Just like that, I was completely fine, as if nothing had ever happened. My mom, stunned by the sudden change, could only stare at me for a moment. She shrugged it off, thinking I was just being a toddler with strange moods, and decided to go ahead and leave for work. Little did she know, the story wasn't over yet. On her way to work, my mother had to make a few detours, as it was always a hectic drive. But as she was nearing the usual spot on the freeway where she would have been at that exact time, she noticed something that made her heart drop. There, in the very spot she would have been, was one of the worst car pileups of that time. It was a massive accident, involving numerous cars, and tragically many people were injured or killed. The scene was chaotic and devastating, and it was clear that my mom had narrowly avoided being caught up in it. That's when it hit her. In that moment, she realized that something had happened with me that delayed her just enough to save her life. As strange as it sounded, I had somehow kept her from being in that spot at the wrong time. My little tantrum, the sudden change in my behavior, and my insistence that she stay home, it all happened for a reason. I had unknowingly delayed her just enough to avoid a terrible fate. From that day forward, my mom never looked at things the same way. She became even more protective and aware of the strange ways life could sometimes work.
While it might have seemed like a regular dramatic tantrum from a toddler, it was as if something, or someone, was looking out for her. She was grateful for that little delay, and I think it made her appreciate the moments with us kids even more. And whenever she retells the story, it's clear that the bond between us was stronger than just mother and child. It was something more. Growing up, my parents and I loved camping. I'm an only child, so every time we went camping, I always got my own tent. I was about 14 years old at the time. I'm 26 now, but I still vividly remember the experience. We lived in Maine, and if you've ever been there, you know how vast and dense the woods are. It felt like there was an endless stretch of forest surrounding us, and that made every camping trip an adventure. We went on a yearly camping trip, but there was one particular night that stands out more than any other. It was around 1 in the morning, and I was lying in my tent, wide awake. I thought I couldn't sleep, but in hindsight I wonder if something was keeping me from it. The air was still, and the woods around us were eerily quiet. My tent wasn't fully zipped, one of those cheap tents where air didn't circulate very well, so I left it a little open for ventilation. That's when I heard it, the sound of a car pulling up, something that seemed completely out of place in the middle of nowhere. I couldn't see much from where I was lying, but I could make out the shape of a white Ford vehicle. I didn't recognize the car, and I didn't know why someone would be out there so late, especially in the woods. A man stepped out of the car. It was hard to make out his face. The light from the car wasn't strong enough, and the shadows from the trees made everything feel more unsettling. He didn't seem to notice that I was awake. He walked up to my tent. My heart was pounding in my chest. I was frozen, unsure what to do. But right then, I blacked out. The next thing I remember is waking up to bright sunlight filtering through the trees. I was disoriented, and my parents were already packing up the campsite. They were getting everything ready to leave, and I hadn't even realized that I had fallen asleep again after hearing the man. I didn't tell my parents about the man I had seen, because I assumed it was some kind of strange dream. We drove to the local supermarket that day. Our flashlights had died the night before, so we needed to buy new batteries. While we were there, I picked up the local newspaper. I was just casually flipping through it when my eyes landed on a headline that stopped me cold. The story read something like this: "Breaking. Boy gone missing. Suspected kidnapping in North Maine woods." I felt a chill run through me. The article described a boy who had gone missing in the woods near our campsite. The area they were talking about was incredibly close to where we had camped, maybe only 15 feet away from where my tent had been set up. I couldn't believe what I was reading. It described the boy's disappearance as a suspected kidnapping, and the authorities were still investigating the case. The more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about that night. The car I heard, the man who walked up to my tent, it all seemed like too much of a coincidence. I don't know if I was just too scared to confront the situation back then, or if I somehow blocked it out. But looking back, it feels like I narrowly avoided being caught up in something much bigger than me. The memory still haunts me. I never found out what exactly happened to that boy, but it's something that still makes me uneasy every time I think about it. I wonder, sometimes, if there's a reason I woke up when I did. Could it have been a warning? Could I have been in danger too? I'll never know for sure, but it's one of those experiences that'll stay with me forever.
His story takes place around 2009 to 2010, during a pretty chaotic time in my life, so I can't recall the exact date. For a bit of context, this all happened in the Albertville, Boaz area in Alabama, where I wasn't originally from. I had a good friend, let's call him George, who, along with his family, took me in when I was about 18 and still figuring things out. George and his wife, who we'll call Kelly, were part of a local paranormal investigation group, which I joined since I'd always been interested in that kind of thing. Kelly had a stepson, let's call him Jim, who was around my age, and we hit it off immediately. Kelly also ran a newspaper route on certain Friday and Saturday nights, which Jim and I sometimes took over. One Friday night, with no investigations planned, Jim and I decided to do the paper route together. We left the house around 10:30 or 11 p.m., drove to Sardis to pick up the papers, and began our route, which started in Boaz, took us through some back roads, and ended in Albertville. The night was going smoothly. We were playing music, cruising along, and just having a great time. Around 1:15 or 1:30 a.m., we reached a particularly dark, remote area along the route where the two towns meet. We turned onto a gravel road leading to a dead end where we had a few deliveries to make. We turned down the music, drove down the gravel road, and pulled up near a few houses surrounded by thick woods. As we were placing the last papers in a mailbox, we heard a deep, guttural shriek coming from the woods behind us. Jim asked if I'd heard it too, and just as I confirmed, we heard it again. Closer this time, as if whatever it was had moved to the edge of the woods just 100 yards away. At that point, Jim decided we were finished there and started driving off. But as we picked up speed, we heard the same unsettling noise once again, this time right behind us. I looked over at Jim, only to realize he was staring out the window beside me, not at me. When I followed his gaze, I saw it, a dark shape running alongside us. It was so black that it seemed to absorb all the light around it, silhouetted even against the night. It looked somewhat like a large wildcat, but with a tattered look, like something with shredded, shadowy fur. There were no visible legs, but it was moving incredibly fast. As we approached a stop sign where the gravel road met a paved one, Jim slowed down slightly, and the creature pulled slightly ahead of us. Just as we reached the sign, it seemed to leap effortlessly over it, and as it did, it turned its head toward us, revealing a single, large, fiery, orange-red eye that burned through the darkness. As we came to a full stop, it darted off to the right, letting out one final, chilling shriek before disappearing into the night. Fortunately, our route took us left, and we finished the rest of our deliveries in record time, getting back to the house by 3 a.m., much earlier than usual. We planned to wake George and tell him what we'd seen, but when we pulled up, he was already on the porch, almost as if he'd been waiting. He looked like he was about to say something, but stopped when he saw our faces, asking what was wrong instead. We told him everything, and he started asking for details, what time it happened, the exact location, and so on. After we'd given him everything we could remember, he took a deep breath, looked at Jim, and said, "Well, I'm sorry to tell you this, but something terrible happened to a man named Rick earlier this morning." Rick was a former member of the paranormal group, someone I hadn't met because he'd left the group a year or so before I joined. It turned out that during their time with the group, Rick and his partner, who we'll call Lisa, had gotten involved with some really dark stuff, experimenting with things that were strictly off limits for everyone else. They'd had a lot of strange and troubling experiences because of it, which ultimately caused them to leave the group and even put strain on their relationship. Earlier that night, around 1 a.m., Rick had gone over to Lisa's place, hoping to convince her to take him back. According to Lisa, he was acting erratically, but at times would seem eerily focused. After an hour of him refusing to leave and causing a scene, Lisa told him she'd called for help, hoping it would make him go. She said he got very quiet, and after a few moments of silence, she assumed he'd left. Help arrived around 1:30 a.m., but when Lisa went to open the door, she found Rick had passed away there on the porch. Lisa's house, as it happens, was along the same road where our gravel road met the paved one, about 2 miles to the right, exactly the direction that dark figure had headed when it left us. George believed that Rick hadn't fully distanced himself from those dark practices, and that what we'd seen was some kind of entity arriving to collect on whatever debts he'd left behind. I've had a few strange experiences in my life, but this one remains one of the most unforgettable. In 1999, I was installing one of my children's museum exhibits in Staten Island, and they put me up on the campus, which had been an old U.S. Navy retirement village compound called Sailor's Snug Harbor, if I recall. Every day for 2 weeks, I took the ferry over from Manhattan, staring at the Twin Towers and thinking, maybe I'll visit this weekend if I finish in time. Anyway, I was given the use of a retired admiral rank house, a standalone brick Georgian, circa 1835. The large campus had several civic buildings for the residents, the library, a grand hall, parade grounds, and of course a large hospital and graveyard. After all, this was the final port of call for our men in blue. During my stay, an independent film crew needed several exterior shots, a carriage arriving and leaving, actors getting in and out, walking towards my house, etc., so they had rented it for the day. My museum day was just as long as a film crew day, 12 to 18 hours. So as I was leaving in the early morning, the PAs were just coming in to set up the location. I'm a movie props maker, but had to stick to my own lane. When I got home that night, the film crew was gone. In and out just like they promised, and I was $100 richer, despite it not being my house at all. The location manager was visibly relieved at the low price, so I told them that I was a local 16IA guy from the West Coast. And since our days matched, and I wasn't expecting any compensation during my stay, I was happy. I'm sure people try to angle for a higher location fee when they hear who the actors are going to be, a recent 007 Bond villain. The company PAs left a small amount of production détruits, a partially full trash bag, and a bunch of those short little water bottles that hold maybe 2 big swallows, sitting here and there all around the house, with barely half a swallow taken out, the discarded twist cap sitting nearby, and a bunch of big summertime houseflies. The crew or actors might have had food inside. In any case, the front door would have been propped open most of the day. I got the impression they had been recording dialogue in the house. Read a line, take a sip of water, read more lines, ask for another bottle, sort of thing. Tired as I was, the noisome noise of 2 or 3 B-52-sized flies in the bedroom was keeping me awake. They seemed to be drinking from the open bottles when I turned on the lights, so I got up and put the lids on the 4 or 5 that had been left in the bedroom. Then I opened the window facing the streetlight and turned off the bedroom lights. A few minutes later, I shut the window and went to bed in silence, only to be awakened sometime in the middle of the night by the sounds of the washing machine going through a cycle down in the basement. You know, fill, agitate, stop, empty, spin, rinse, fill, repeat, etc. I went down in the morning to see what the deal was. Ancient basement. It had a finished floor, but barely. Dangling bare bulbs, psycho style, and 2 ordinary-looking laundry machines, a washer and dryer hooked up with modern fittings. I opened the lid, and to my amazement, the washer drum was full to the top with that sand and glacier gravel just like you find all over New York State when you pop a shovel in the ground. I went back upstairs to get ready for work and saw one big dead housefly floating on its back inside one of the bottles I sealed. It felt creepy. One night, my uncle decided to stop by his favorite local bar after a long week of work. It was one of those dimly lit, cozy places where the bartender knew most of the regulars by name and even remembered their usual orders. My uncle wasn't particularly looking for company. He just wanted a drink and a bit of time to unwind. But as he sat down at the bar, a man beside him struck up a conversation. The man seemed genuinely friendly and easygoing. He was well-spoken, charming in a subtle way, and had an easy smile that made my uncle feel at ease. They started talking about everything and anything that crossed their minds, from the weather to the latest sports scores, and even a little bit about their lives. My uncle remembered thinking it was unusual to feel that comfortable with a complete stranger, especially in a bar. But something about this man made him feel relaxed. Over the next few weeks, they bumped into each other again at the bar a few more times. Each time they would chat, sometimes for hours, sharing stories, laughing at jokes, and occasionally opening up about life's struggles and dreams. My uncle didn't learn too much personal information about him. The guy was somewhat private, but he figured everyone has their boundaries. Still, my uncle grew to genuinely like him. In fact, he even mentioned the man to a couple of family members, describing him as a really nice guy he'd been chatting with at the bar. Then, one evening, my uncle went to the bar, hoping to see his friend and catch up. But the man wasn't there. My uncle shrugged it off, thinking he probably had other plans that night. But as weeks went by, and then months, he noticed that he hadn't seen his friend in quite a while. He asked the bartender about him, but nobody seemed to know much about where the man had gone. Maybe he'd moved to another city or found a new favorite bar, my uncle thought. Life moved on, and the memory of his friend became just one of those casual encounters that drift away with time. Months later, life was back to normal, and my uncle hadn't thought about his old bar friend for quite a while. Then, one day, he received a letter from the county courthouse summoning him for jury duty. He didn't think much of it, as it was a typical civic duty that most people got called to at some point. He marked his calendar and, on the scheduled day, showed up at the courthouse, expecting the usual process. Wait around, listen to some briefings, and possibly sit through a mundane case or two. However, as he entered the courtroom and took his seat among the jury pool, he noticed that the atmosphere was unusually tense. He could feel a strange energy in the room, a sense of heaviness. Curious, he leaned over to a fellow potential juror and whispered, "Do you know what this case is about?" The person beside him looked at him with wide eyes and muttered, "It's a big one. They say it's for a suspected serial killer." My uncle's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected to be part of something this serious. Trying to shake off the nerves, he sat up straight, focusing on the case that was about to unfold. Then, as the court session began, the doors opened, and the accused was escorted into the room by security. My uncle turned to see the man being led into the courtroom and felt his breath catch. It was his friend from the bar. For a moment, he couldn't process what he was seeing. He stared in shock, trying to reconcile the friendly face he knew with the gravity of the accusations that hung over the courtroom. How could it be the same person? The man who had laughed with him, shared stories with him, and seemed so normal, so nice, was now standing accused of unthinkable crimes. As the trial began, the details of the case were laid out in excruciating detail. My uncle sat in disbelief as he listened to the charges, the evidence, and the accounts of people who had crossed paths with this man in much darker circumstances. Bit by bit, the image of his friendly bar acquaintance was replaced with a stranger, a figure capable of acts that went beyond anything he could have ever imagined. The experience left him shaken to his core. Even after the trial was over and he went back to his normal routine, the memory lingered. How could someone he thought he knew, someone he'd shared drinks and stories with, turn out to be hiding such a dark, sinister side? To this day, my uncle talks about it only occasionally, almost as if speaking about it too often would make it feel too real. But when he does, there's a strange look in his eyes, a mix of disbelief and something close to sadness. It serves as a reminder that sometimes we really have no idea who the people around us truly are. The invitation came in the form of a small, worn-out envelope, with my name scrawled across it in a handwriting that seemed oddly unfamiliar, yet somehow comforting. It had been over a decade since I'd last heard anything from my cousin's family, and we'd only spoken briefly a few times by phone. So when I received this unexpected invitation to a dinner at his home, I was surprised, even a bit hesitant. I'd never met my cousin face-to-face before, and all I had was a vague memory of my mother mentioning them from time to time, always with a hint of mystery. The address was peculiar. My GPS couldn't recognize it, displaying an error whenever I tried to load directions. Reluctantly, I resorted to pinning the location on an old map, and after a quick glance, I realized it was well off any route I'd ever taken, situated somewhere in the more remote countryside. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I packed my things, got in my car, and set out as twilight began to stretch across the sky. As I drove, the surroundings gradually began to change. Streetlights disappeared, replaced by the dense cover of trees that arched over the road, their dark branches crisscrossing in an almost sinister canopy. I passed endless rows of empty fields, the occasional rundown barn, and not a single house in sight. The sense of isolation crept up on me, making the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. I glanced at my phone, still no signal. The silence of the countryside was unnerving, broken only by the soft hum of my car's engine. "Where the hell am I going?" I muttered, casting a wary glance around. But I pressed on, hoping the dinner would be worth this eerie detour. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I spotted an address that closely matched the one on the invitation. The house itself was a grim spectacle, almost hidden by the thicket of trees and undergrowth that had overgrown around it. Moss clung to its sides, and thick vines wove across the crumbling walls. It looked like no one had lived there in years. "This can't be it," I whispered, feeling a strange dread settle over me. Still, as soon as I turned into the driveway, two figures emerged from the dimly lit front porch. They were smiling, waving me over. My aunt and uncle. Despite the unsettling state of the house, they seemed delighted to see me, rushing over to greet me with warm hugs, as though we'd known each other for years. Come in," they said, ushering me inside before I could ask any questions. The interior was surprisingly inviting, if a bit worn and outdated. I could smell something delicious wafting from the kitchen, pot roast maybe, and my stomach rumbled. My aunt had gone all out, setting up the dining room with platters of food and old family photo albums on display, each one yellowed and dusty. They invited me to sit,
and as we waited for my cousin, who they said had run a few errands, we chatted about family, catching up on years' worth of stories. They asked me about my mom, how she was doing, and reminisced about memories I didn't even know they had shared. At times, their knowledge of family details seemed oddly specific, as though they had been watching from afar all these years. I was put off, but chalked it up to the excitement of reconnecting. Dinner was surprisingly pleasant, and my aunt's cooking was incredible. We ate until I was stuffed, and afterward they suggested a game of Uno, pulling out an old, worn deck from the shelf. We played for hours, laughing and bantering, and as the sky darkened outside, I realized just how isolated we truly were. There wasn't a sound beyond the walls. No distant hum of cars, no animals, just a dense silence that seemed to press in on the house. Eventually, I checked my watch. It was nearing 9 p.m. and my cousin still hadn't returned. I felt a creeping discomfort and decided it was time to head back. I politely told them I had to leave, explaining that I had work the next morning. The moment I said it, their expressions changed. My aunt gave me an almost pitying look. "You're not planning on driving back now, are you? It's dark, and these roads are tricky even in daylight." My uncle chimed in, looking visibly uneasy. "Stay the night. We have the guest room all made up for you. It's much safer." The insistence in their voices was unsettling, as if there was something they weren't telling me. I forced a smile and assured them that I could navigate my way back just fine, brushing off their worried glances. But when I stood up, they blocked my way, both of them now with pleading expressions. "Please," my aunt whispered. "You don't know what's out there. It's not safe to leave now." A strange chill ran down my spine, and a sense of urgency flared within me. I couldn't explain it, but something felt off. These people, though polite and familiar, seemed almost desperate to keep me there. It was as if they had been waiting for something. Waiting for me. With a tight smile, I nodded and pretended to relent. "Fine, I'll stay," I said, watching their expressions soften with relief. But as soon as they went to fetch the bedding, I darted out the front door, slipping quietly into my car and starting the engine. The wheels crunched over the gravel as I tore out of the driveway, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. The house, with its dark windows and shadowed corners, disappeared quickly in my rearview mirror, swallowed up by the night. Driving out of that desolate area was just as difficult as getting there. I was lost for what felt like hours, retracing routes, narrowly avoiding trees that loomed like shadowy figures on either side of the narrow road. At last, a familiar road sign appeared, and I sped up, feeling a wave of relief as I finally left that dreadful place behind. By the time I arrived home, it was well past 11 p.m. Not wanting to wake my parents, I climbed over the fence and slipped in through the back door, careful to make as little noise as possible. But as soon as I stepped into the kitchen, I froze. The lights were on, and there was my mom, sitting at the table, arms crossed and a deeply concerned expression on her face. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. I blinked, confused. "I was at Aunt Deborah's house. You knew this. They invited me for dinner." Her face paled. "Aunt Deborah called hours ago," she whispered. "She said you never showed up." I stood there, staring at her, my mind racing. My aunt had called? But I had just spent the entire evening with her and my uncle. I had eaten their food, sat at their table, laughed and played games in their old creaky house. And yet, an icy chill crept over me as I replayed the night's events in my mind, the unsettling details surfacing now with sharp clarity. The strange address, the dilapidated house, my cousin who never showed up, and my aunt and uncle's insistence that I stay the night. Till this day,
I never knew who I visited. It was a rainy Saturday night. I was out in a restaurant with some friends having a great time. It was almost midnight and we had to leave. We came out, said our goodbyes, and I walked towards my car. I got in and started driving towards my home. I had a long day and was really tired. It was about an hour's drive to my house. On my way, I started to feel sleepy, so I turned on the radio to keep me awake. But there was some problem with the radio. All I could hear was static. I was checking the radio when suddenly I saw someone standing straight ahead in the middle of the road. I severed left and applied the brakes hard. The car screeched to a stop. I got out of the car to check, but there was no one there. I looked around where I saw the person standing, but there was no one to be seen around. No person, no tire marks, no indication that anything happened. I thought that my mind was playing tricks on me. I was just really sleepy. I went back to my car, checked the car. Everything seemed to be working except the radio. I was a little shaky after that incident and went on to drive slowly towards my home. I reached home at 1 a.m. Just as I got in, my phone rang. It was Andy, one of the friends with whom I was having dinner earlier tonight. He sounded worried, and he said that he was calling to check that I reached home safely or not. I told him that I was okay and asked what the matter was. He sounded confused and scared. He told that while driving home on the way he saw a guy who looked just like me standing there in the middle of the road. He thought that he had hit me with his car, but when he went out to see, there was no one there. That was very weird. I said that even I experienced the same thing. He said that he had called the other two friends too, and even they saw something similar. He started to panic. I told him not to think about it too much right now and just go to bed. We'll figure this out tomorrow. After the call, I took a nice hot shower and then went to bed. Next morning, the four of us had decided to meet at the same restaurant and discuss the events of last night. I reached there early, only to see that the restaurant had been burned down to the ground. The entire place had just been completely destroyed by the fire. There were paramedics and firemen checking for any survivors and trying to get the dead bodies out. I saw an onlooker standing at the side or the road and went up to him to ask what had happened there. He told that there was a fire last night, a big one. No one survived. All the people were trapped inside the building. No one could call the fire department as all the phone lines were destroyed. The fire engines and the paramedics came in the morning when everyone was already dead. I felt that was very strange, as we had just had dinner there last night. I went towards the road to wait for my friends. As I was going, I saw one of the paramedics taking a dead body out. It was charred, but somehow the face looked familiar. I looked closer and then I remembered where I had seen him. I was talking to him a couple minutes ago. I turned back to see, but he was gone. I started freaking out, thinking that, did I really see a ghost? The paramedic placed the dead body next to another one. Coincidentally, it also looked familiar. To my surprise, this was the person who I had seen last night, the one I thought that I almost hit with my car. But from his wounds, it looked like he had died there in the fire too. My head was starting to spin. What was going on? It was as if suddenly I was seeing ghosts everywhere. By this time, my friend Andy reached there too and was shocked to see the place burned down. "How is that even possible?" he said. "We were almost the last ones out of here and the owner said that they had to close the place." "Yeah, I know. It is all very weird. This place burning down and me suddenly seeing ghosts everywhere." "What ghosts?" Andy asked. I told him about the dead bodies lying there and how I had seen the same guy last night and then today morning too. "That is strange," Andy said. "I did not see any ghost, but I remember seeing you last night in front of my car." Just as he spoke those words, I saw the paramedics carry out 4 more bodies: Andy, me, and our 2 other friends. All 4 were burned. I looked at Andy, then at my burned and lifeless body, being carried away right in front of my eyes. The house was blanketed in silence, an uneasy calm settling over everything. My husband had left a while ago, just to pick up a few things he'd forgotten, and I'd been waiting for him to come back. I'd tried to distract myself, reading on the couch, but the ticking of the clock seemed louder than usual, filling the empty space. I kept glancing at the door, hoping he'd return soon. He was taking longer than I expected. Then, just as I began to nod off, a noise jolted me awake. A faint rustling outside the door. I held my breath, listening. It was so quiet I could have dismissed it as the wind, but there it was again, a subtle scratching sound, like someone or something was fumbling with the lock. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was probably nothing, that I was being paranoid. But as I sat up, the sound grew louder, now unmistakably deliberate, as though someone was testing the lock, pushing against it, trying to get in. Fear prickled up my spine, and without thinking, I darted into the bedroom and slipped into the closet, pulling the door almost closed, but leaving a tiny crack to see through. I crouched low, willing my breath to steady, listening for any movement. And then, just as I huddled into the shadows, I felt an arm wrap around my shoulders, a firm, familiar grip that pulled me back. I almost screamed, but then relief flooded over me. It was my husband. He must have come in quietly, heard the same noises I had, and slipped into the closet to hide with me. I leaned into him, heart still pounding, but now with the comfort of his presence. His arm stayed around me, his hand warm and steady on my shoulder, offering silent reassurance. We crouched there together, side by side, listening. The front door creaked open. Someone had come inside. The soft thud of footsteps filled the house, slow and measured, as if the intruder was in no rush, taking their time with each step. My husband's arm tightened around me, grounding me as the footsteps moved through the rooms, approaching the hallway, drawing closer to our hiding place. I held my breath, every nerve on edge, straining to hear every movement. I could feel my husband's steady presence behind me, his hand gripping mine now, a silent promise that we'd get through this together. But the footsteps stopped right outside the bedroom door. The doorknob turned, and the door swung open with a low creak. My husband's grip on my hand grew firmer, anchoring me as we stayed as still as possible, hoping the intruder wouldn't notice us. Silence stretched out, thick and tense, before a familiar voice suddenly broke it. "Hey, babe, I'm back. I forgot my keys." It was my husband's voice, calling out cheerfully from the front door. The world seemed to tilt. My body went rigid, my blood freezing in my veins. My husband was outside. He had just come home. If he was at the door, then who was in the closet with me? A wave of dread crashed over me, a sickening realization twisting in my stomach. I felt the weight of the arm still around my shoulders, warm and solid, the hand still gripping mine, fingers intertwined with mine as if nothing were wrong. Every instinct told me to run, to scream, but fear kept me rooted in place, my body locked in terror. Slowly, Carefully, I pulled my hand away, my skin crawling as I felt the grip loosen, allowing my hand to slip free. I could barely breathe, my mind racing, heart pounding as I tried to process the horror of what was happening. Outside, I could hear my husband's footsteps, his voice calling out again, growing louder as he made his way down the hall. "Babe, are you here?" I stumbled forward, almost falling out of the closet, gasping for air as I rushed toward my husband, my body shaking with terror. He caught me, his eyes widening in confusion and concern as he steadied me. I was trembling. Without saying a word, I pointed to the closet. He opened it, but to my surprise, there was nobody inside.